The morning unfolded like clockwork, unrushed and mechanical. At precisely 8:45, the volunteers began unfolding the chairs. Metal legs scraped against the pavement as they were aligned into neat, symmetrical rows facing the small flag-covered platform. The park grounds had been freshly trimmed the night before, and a faint smell of grass still lingered in the dew. A brass band tuned in the corner near the bleachers, their instruments catching glints of rising sun. The guests filtered in gradually, uniforms in all shades of blue, green, and camouflage. Some were pressed and new, others faded and wrinkled by time, but each one wore its own weight of memory. He arrived with no entourage, no badge, no announcement. A man moving through space without the need to take it. His boots struck the cement path with silent authority, black leather dulled by age, not neglect. He didn't wear sunglasses, though the sun bore down harsh and white. His cap was pulled low, the shadow just enough to obscure the details of his eyes, but not the lines etched around them. Lines from heat. Lines from nights that never ended. Lines earned one grim hour at a time. He paused near the outer edge of the gathering, where no cameras pointed and no reserved seats waited. He didn't scan the crowd. He scanned the terrain. The exits. The angles. The spacing between trees. The elevated corners of the nearby parking structure. It was automatic, instinctual. Not fear. Just memory. Habit. Most attendees didn't notice him. Those that did offered brief, curious glances. A few younger soldiers looked twice. Something about the uniform. About the way he stood, not stiff, but anchored. Like someone who knew that standing still could be a defensive posture. That waiting, in silence, could be a strategy. As more guests arrived, the atmosphere thickened with formality. A young officer with bright medals stepped onto the platform to test the microphone. Others gathered by the refreshments, talking in careful tones about deployments, families, and upcoming transfers. For most of them, this day was ceremonial, a break from routine, a photo opportunity, a box checked in a monthly calendar. For him, it was something else. He hadn't attended an event like this in over a decade. Not because he couldn't, but because it had never been for him. And yet here he stood. From a distance, he was hard to place. The uniform was regulation, every stitch correct, every bar and ribbon aligned with exactitude. The stars on his shoulder weren't showy. They were silent. He wore them the way one carries loss, carefully and without the need to explain. No one could deny the accuracy of the garments, but still, they doubted the man inside them. Not because he looked wrong, but because he didn't arrive with proof. No one knew the missions he had led. They weren't the kind you could look up. He had operated beneath the fold of headlines, beyond clearance levels of those now mocking him from behind polished ranks. He had given orders under blackout conditions. His words had saved convoys, rerouted evacuees, and stopped catastrophes by the slimmest of margins. He had commanded silence and been rewarded with it. So now, when the whispers began, he did not flinch. The first came from a junior officer, barely 30, with the shine of recent promotion in his voice. He gestured subtly toward the man in the back. Whispered something about inconsistencies. The decorations. The boots. The face. Soon others joined in, not malicious, just certain. Certain that such presence required credentials beyond quiet confidence. They hadn't seen him before. He hadn't RSVP'd. He hadn't introduced himself. Surely he was an impersonator. A fraud seeking attention. They didn't confront him directly, not yet. They laughed into their palms. Eyed him with sideways glances. A clipboard passed from one official to another. A whispered message relayed, "There's someone in the back wearing stars. He doesn't belong here." And the weight of assumption grew. He stood still. The moments passed, and with them came more arrivals. Veterans from past wars, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, unnamed theaters. Some nodded quietly to one another. Some walked slowly, leaning on canes and the arms of younger family. Their uniforms didn't match anymore. Their jackets bore mismatched pins. But their silence held a language deeper than protocol. One of them, a man with a deep scar along his jawline and a missing ring finger, spotted the stranger. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but recognition. He didn't speak. He didn't approach. He simply adjusted his seat to face slightly toward him, as if acknowledging something others hadn't yet understood. Then came the moment. The clipboard official approached him. Dressed in ceremonial uniform, posture straight with the stiffness of training, the woman offered a practiced look. One that had been rehearsed for situations involving trespassers, misidentifications, and security errors. He listened, impassive. She pointed toward the exit. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He nodded once, slowly, as if to say, yes, this is what happens now. But he didn't move. Behind her, laughter. A young enlisted man joked loudly, sure the stranger had finally been exposed. Someone snapped a photo. Another began to draft a message to their group chat. But the veteran with the scar did move. He stood, walked past rows of folding chairs, and halted in front of the stranger. For a long moment, they simply stood facing each other. A half-inch difference in height, a decade's difference in age, but equal in bearing, equal in loss. The scarred man raised his hand, not in salute, in signal, 2 fingers against his brow. The old field gesture used in covert ops. The gesture for, I see you, and the stranger nodded. Only then did the younger officials begin to realize something had gone wrong. The veteran turned to face them. His eyes were sharp now, no longer dulled by retirement. He stepped aside. The murmurs faded. The joking ceased. The clipboard lowered. The whispers died. The stranger walked forward. And this time, the silence was not judgment. It was recognition. Uneasy, delayed, but spreading. He moved to an empty seat in the front row. Not because it was his place, but because no one else could take it now. The seat creaked faintly beneath him as he settled in. The front row absorbing his weight like a courtroom forced to make space for a defendant it had just accused. No one moved. The program had not yet begun, and yet the room had already shifted. The podium remained empty, the flags fluttering behind it, but all attention had coalesced around the man in the first seat on the left, the one they had tried to push out, the one they now couldn't stop watching. Across the aisle, the older veteran with the scar took his seat without fanfare, adjusting his jacket collar with the meticulousness of habit. He didn't look back at the crowd. He didn't need to. He had made his statement without words, and it hung heavier than any anthem ever could. Behind them, the rows filled with silence that wasn't quite reverent, but wasn't disrespectful anymore either. It was confusion, uncertainty manifesting as restraint. Young officers who had scoffed now avoided eye contact. Their swagger dulled. The clipboard official lingered awkwardly near the edge of the platform, glancing at her phone, then back at him. She was reading, cross-checking, searching for something in the registration database that would make this easier to swallow. His name wasn't there. Not in any of the files. Not on any of the invitee lists. Not even a whisper in the command chain contacts. But still he sat there, composed, entirely calm. That calm began to infect the crowd, like an algorithm overriding noise. He didn't look around, didn't fidget, just sat with his hands resting gently on his knees, watching the breeze tease the flags above. His cap remained low. The sun had shifted slightly, creating a soft gleam across the edge of his medals. The sheen wasn't bright. It wasn't new. It was earned. The MC took the stage at last. A man with the posture of a bureaucrat and the voice of someone used to microphone authority. He welcomed the attendees, gave the obligatory opening lines about unity, duty, sacrifice. The audience tried to listen, but attention kept drifting. To him, the general who wasn't announced, the presence they had not expected. As the speeches continued, a slideshow began behind the podium, a looping reel of photos featuring soldiers in the field. Many faces familiar to those in the crowd. Many long past. The images flashed. Convoy roads, forward operating bases, sunrise over barbed wire. Then came a frame that stilled the audience. A grainy photo of a younger man in the field, eyes shaded under a helmet, pointing across a trench line. His face was mostly obscured, but there was something in the bearing. The silence grew thicker. The general didn't blink, didn't look away. It wasn't the first time his shadow had appeared in places without a name. Further into the presentation, the slideshow paused on an image captioned "Recovery Mission, Unnamed Theater." It showed 5 soldiers, mud-covered and gaunt, huddled behind wreckage. One stood, taller than the rest, uniform torn, face bloodied, his expression calm, sharp eyes staring into the camera, a blurred streak on his collar where rank had been removed. The image had circulated in underground military forums, often cited in training simulations. But the subject was never named. Until now, a ripple spread. Someone 3 rows back leaned forward. Someone else tapped a phone screen. The general sat, unmoved. Outside the ceremony, in the parking lot, a black SUV arrived and parked in a corner. 2 men stepped out, both in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable stance of soldiers too long in the field. They didn't wear medals. They wore memory. One of them carried a small steel case. They didn't walk toward the event immediately. They waited. Back inside, the ceremony had reached its midpoint. A younger Marine stood now, reciting a story about his first deployment. He spoke with pride, with precision, but his voice trembled as it approached the ending. He had mentioned a superior officer only known to his squad as the Shadow, a commander who never raised his voice, never gave orders twice, but always knew what others missed. The soldier paused as he realized he was here. He looked down at the front row and understood. The room grew still again. The MC stepped aside. Then, in a move clearly off-script, he announced a special moment of reflection. He gestured toward the chairs lined along the stage, each reserved for honored guests. One remained open. An awkward silence passed as he fumbled the name on the index card. It wasn't a real name. It was a placeholder. And still, everyone knew who it was meant for now. The general didn't stand. He didn't need to. The soldier from the story approached him, offered a single paper, his own field report, written from a hospital bed years ago. It had never been acknowledged by command. It simply disappeared into the system. He handed it to the man. The general glanced at it, then folded it once and tucked it into his coat. Another silence followed. Then movement. The 2 men from the SUV entered quietly from the side. No words, just presence. They approached the general, one standing beside him, the other placing the steel case on the stage. The crowd shifted, unsure whether to intervene or observe. The case opened. Inside, a single commendation plaque. Matte finish. No glitter. No ceremony. Just engraved steel bearing a name. His name. Rank, General. Division, Classified Command. Service, 34 years active, 7 years deployed off-grid. Commendation, Legacy Protocol Citation 3X. Status, honored in silence. He didn't look at it for long. He stood, and in standing erased every doubt. Not because of what the plaque said, but because of what the silence finally allowed them to feel. No more jokes, no more assumptions, no more questioning of the uniform that, minutes before, they believed was fake. He had worn it through deserts, through bombed-out roads, through night air thick with dust and grief, and he had worn it through their disbelief too. Now he walked to the center of the stage, not to speak, just to be seen. This time they didn't look away. The plaque remained untouched on the stage as the general stood before it, the weight of unspoken truth casting a deeper shadow than any decoration. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the edges of the flags behind him, as if they too were acknowledging their mistake. Belated, uncertain, but real. No music played. No horns signaled recognition. Only the breathless stillness of a crowd that now watched the man they had tried to erase take his place at the center. He didn't raise the plaque. He didn't touch it at all. Instead, he stood beside it, posture square, shoulders drawn with quiet certainty. His boots were planted evenly. His cap remained on. His silence still more commanding than any prepared speech. Those who had doubted him hours earlier now found themselves shifting in their seats, unable to meet his eyes, and even more unable to look away. The organizers whispered behind the stage curtain. Emails buzzed on silenced phones. A flurry of internal messages exchanged between ranking personnel who hadn't been briefed for this. His name hadn't been printed in the official program because it hadn't been submitted. It hadn't been submitted because it had never needed to be. His presence wasn't for their schedule. His uniform didn't require introduction. He had arrived because this wasn't for them. He had come for the fallen. And so, after a long pause, he stepped down from the stage. One slow step at a time. He walked through the rows again, but now the space around him widened. Not out of fear, out of reverence. The crowd adjusted itself naturally, making room without being told. And then they followed him with their eyes as he veered not toward the reception tent or the photo booth set up with flags, but toward the far end of the lawn, where no lights had been positioned and no speeches had been scheduled. There stood the names. The stone wall was older than most of the attendees, chiseled with last names and ranks, some already fading from sun and time. It was quiet there, surrounded by a low barrier and neatly kept hedges. Most passed it with nods or a brief photo, but the general approached it like a battlefield. He paused before it, then slowly knelt. The grass accepted his weight. The years in his knees protested, but he lowered himself with care. His fingers, calloused and steady, reached for the edge of the stone, not to trace his own past, but to touch the names of those whose stories never made it past the debriefing room. Men and women who had followed orders he had issued, who had fought under coordinates he had marked, who had never known he stood at the other end of the chain. Until it was too late. No one disturbed him. No cameras clicked. Even the ceremony paused. People watched from a distance, uncertain if they were witnessing mourning or command. But it was both. He remained there, motionless, head bowed. Not in guilt, but in permanence. The kind of reflection only carried by those who have written last words for others, who have packed gear left behind, who have spoken to parents in the void of mourning. Minutes passed. Then he stood. And when he did, his knees shook faintly, not from age but from memory. He walked back toward the crowd. This time, slowly, deliberately, like one who had already walked through fire and now carried only the ashes as proof. The clipboard officer stepped aside. She didn't speak. She only lowered her gaze. Beside her, the junior officer who had laughed earlier now stood with clenched jaw and quiet eyes. He didn't salute. He couldn't. His hand hovered briefly, then fell. The general didn't stop to acknowledge them. Not out of pettiness, but because the past doesn't wait for apologies. Back near the stage, a row of recruits sat nervously in dress uniforms. Their first year of service marked by routine drills and short briefings, they had never seen a man of such authority move so quietly. One of them, young, barely 20, watched every step Malik took with wide eyes, as if witnessing something sacred he didn't yet have the words for. The general paused in front of them, not to lecture, not to posture. He looked down at their uniforms, still sharp, still light from wear. He noticed one sleeve slightly crooked, one boot untied, one recruit blinking too fast. He adjusted none of them. He simply nodded. Once, and moved on. That nod would stay with them for years. Through field rotations, through fatigue, through the moments when they questioned themselves and what they were capable of. They would remember that someone who carried more than they ever would had looked at them and seen not amateurs but potential. The event finally resumed, but the tone had changed. The planned entertainment portion, music, performances, and press, was cut short. The director made a quiet statement about unexpected presence and honored lineage. She never said his name. She didn't need to, because by then everyone knew. When the general finally left, he didn't walk toward the parking lot. He crossed the grass alone, exiting through a side gate with no signage. The SUV that had dropped off his citation team was gone. He didn't wait for a ride. He didn't need a vehicle to carry dignity. He walked. And as he walked, those still lingering outside the venue slowly stepped back, clearing his path like witnesses in a sacred procession. Some removed their caps. Others held their breath. All of them watched as the man in the fake uniform disappeared into the world that had once called him invisible. The city behind the park never paused. Its pulse beat through traffic lights, through the whispering tires on pavement, through 1,000 simultaneous notifications lighting up in pockets and dashboards. But within that chaos, the general moved untouched. He walked without rush. The world around him kept shifting, loud and unaware, but he passed through it as if it were fog. The same way he had passed through jungles, villages, no-man's lands, and war zones that had no names, only consequences. His uniform, still impeccable, drew glances from civilians. Most didn't look long enough to recognize the significance of what they were seeing. Some assumed he was heading to a parade. Others thought it was a film shoot. One or two took out phones to photograph him discreetly, uncertain whether to post or delete. The uniform told a story most of them were too distracted to hear. He walked until the pavement turned into old stone where the road curved into an underpass marked with peeling murals of soldiers and silhouettes. He stopped at the rusted bench beside the wall where a plaque once commemorated a veteran now forgotten. He sat down, quietly, as if returning to a checkpoint. Above him, pigeons circled the crumbling edge of the bridge. Across the street, in an unassuming building with bars over the windows, a door opened. A woman stepped out, gray-haired, carrying a clipboard, not military but familiar. She saw him and paused mid-step. Her eyes scanned him once. Recognition flickered, not in a gasp, but in how her breath caught. Then she simply nodded and returned inside. She had worked intelligence in a past life. She knew a ghost when she saw one. The general remained seated. Inside his coat pocket, he carried a folded sheet, an old, yellowed service record that had never made it to digital archives. It wasn't redacted. It was erased. His name was never listed in public logs. His missions never declared. There were no hashtags for his battles. No documentaries made. But the record was real. A single paragraph with dates that didn't match headlines, with operations that never appeared on maps. He had kept it not to prove anything, but to remember who he became when no one was watching. Because the real weight of service isn't worn, it's carried. The bench creaked beneath him as he shifted, pulling a small notebook from his side pocket. Inside, notes written in code, not encryption habit. The way you learn to think when information is dangerous and time is fragile. Names of soldiers who never came home. Coordinates of missions that succeeded only because someone at the last minute made a decision that defied protocol but saved lives. These notes weren't for publication. They were memorials. He turned the page and paused. A faded photo tucked between the leaves slipped out, 5 men in mismatched gear, seated on a half-destroyed truck. Smiles tired, eyes fierce. One of them, half in frame, held a flare gun like it was a cigarette. None of them had been awarded what they should have. 2 were later buried in countries their families never got to see. He folded the page and placed it back into the spine of the book. A bus passed in front of him. When it cleared, a young man had appeared across the street. Athletic, clean-shaven, hands deep in jacket pockets. He stood there, staring not with awe, but with focus. He didn't approach, just watched. The general noticed him but didn't react. He recognized the stance. Civilian clothes but military posture. Surveillance-grade stillness. Someone who had either served or had been trained to observe. Moments passed. The young man crossed the street and sat on the opposite end of the bench. They said nothing, but something exchanged between them in silence. Respect, hesitation, memory. The younger man pulled a folded printout from his jacket, laid it on the bench between them. It was a personnel log, printed recently. On the margin, circled in pen, was a name. Not the general's real name, but one of his code names. Beneath it, status, DNE, does not exist. The general looked at it, read the line, then tapped the corner of the paper once, softly, before sliding it back. No need to confirm. No need to deny. Somewhere, far beyond them, a data center continued to function without that name. That was the point. The younger man stood and nodded once before walking away. No salute, just understanding. He would carry the story, or maybe just the truth of that moment. It would be enough. Back on the bench, the general sat a while longer. Not waiting, just remembering. Then he rose, stiff in the knees again, and walked toward the train station. Beneath the concrete platform, the tunnel roared with approaching wind. The train arrived, hissed its doors open, and he stepped inside. No one noticed. He found a seat near the back and placed his cap in his lap. The train moved. Each light in the tunnel passed over his face, casting brief, flickering reflections across the metals on his chest. Some were bent slightly. One had a chip in the enamel. All of them told stories no stage would ever hear. He closed his eyes. Not from sleep, from memory. The train slid through the city's underbelly like a whisper, its steel body carving silence through the dark tunnels beneath concrete and commerce. The general sat with still hands and an unmoving face, eyes closed not in rest, but in pause. Every vibration through the floor, every slight change in pressure from a curve taken too sharply, registered in his body. The hum of motion resonated with memories, like the low drone of engines above a base long dismantled. At the next station, New passengers boarded. None of them noticed him, just another figure in a forgotten seat. One man, with tired eyes and paint-smeared boots, glanced at his decorations, paused briefly, and then turned away. There was recognition in the glance, but also restraint. It was the kind of look exchanged only between people who know the cost of proving themselves. Outside, the city began to transform. Skyscrapers gave way to warehouses. Clean lines blurred into rust and utility. The train moved further from the center, into places not named on tourist maps, where silence came not from reverence but from neglect. The general disembarked at an industrial platform with no signage. Gravel cracked beneath his soles as he stepped down. The air was thick with iron and old oil, the ghosts of factories that had once pumped heat and sound into the sky. He walked through a fenced gate that closed behind him with a soft metallic click, and then continued along an overgrown footpath until he reached a concrete building squatting beneath the shadow of a radio tower. He pressed a weathered keypad near the door. No lights, no sound. Then the lock clicked. Inside, the building was cooler, quieter, layered in dust but clean in its essential spaces. The kind of place that had once served a greater purpose, now hollowed out but intact, untouched by the city's push for modernization. On the wall, a faded map of global zones peeled at the corners. In the corner sat a metal desk, still bearing the scratches of heavy use, the shape of elbows, the ghost of tension. He placed his cap on the desk and began unbuttoning the jacket, not as a soldier returning from duty, but as a man shedding another layer of assumption. Beneath the uniform, a dark gray undershirt clung to a frame still hardened by endurance. Scars, some shallow, others deep, marked his arms. He rolled his sleeves up to the elbow, sat at the desk, and reached beneath the drawers. A hidden compartment clicked open. Inside was a file, handwritten, thick with H. He placed it carefully in front of him and opened it. The pages weren't organized by year. They weren't labeled at all. There were no official seals. Only field notes, clipped photos, GPS scribbles, and hand-drawn schematics. These were never for briefing rooms. They were the kinds of records kept when official eyes are blind by design. He ran his fingers down the first page. A forgotten mission. A jungle. Coordinates lost to a landslide. A squad pinned for 72 hours with no air support. His orders had been to evacuate only 2. He brought home all 7. The margin bore a note, written in tight print, disobeyed. Correctly. He turned the page. Another fragment. Another moment of absolute pressure. Hostage recovery with no confirmation of survival. A single flare fired into the dark, marking extraction for a team who'd given up. He'd been told not to go back. He did. They made it. No medals issued. No reports filed. Further in the file, a black and white photo, him, 20 years younger, standing at a folding table in a field tent, finger pointed at a crude map. Others stood around him, some with eyes locked in focus, others with fear poorly hidden. Their faces all bore the same thing, trust. The kind of trust that didn't ask for credentials. Just results. He closed the file gently. This building had once been a staging hub. No longer active. No longer needed. But it was his. And more than that, it was real. He stood and opened a small locker near the rear wall. Inside were the belongings of men whose stories hadn't been completed. Not by death, but by deletion. Letters never sent. Patches never sewn. A half-destroyed notebook with weather-damaged pages. A rank pin wrapped in cloth. He removed the cloth. Held the pin in his hand. Its metal was tarnished but not dulled. He placed it beside the file on the desk. Then, in the far corner, he opened a case. Inside, a satellite laptop with outdated firmware, self-contained and disconnected from every global node. He booted it up. The screen flickered with old green type. A passcode prompt blinked. He entered the command. Lines of text filled the screen, logs, notes, messages left unsent, reports never uploaded. They scrolled by like memories not yet sorted. He searched until he found what he was looking for, a list of unit IDs. Each with a status beside it. One of them still read, awaiting closure. He clicked it. A message opened, an after-action report drafted but never signed. He began to type, not with the urgency of someone reclaiming his name, but with the steadiness of a man who knew that some truths could only be recorded in silence. The report finished. He saved it, logged the entry under a new tag for whoever remembers. And then, as the screen dimmed, he looked at his own reflection in the dark glass. Not to admire, not to measure time, just to confirm that he was still here, still carrying it. Not for validation, but for continuity. Because history doesn't begin where people notice. It begins in shadow with those who chose to act when no one was looking. Dawn came quietly over the city. The horizon bled into hues of slate blue and faded gold, the buildings still half asleep in their jagged silence. Streetlights blinked reluctantly as they shut off one by one. The hum of awakening life began to crawl back into concrete, street vendors setting up carts, sanitation crews moving through alleyways, early buses groaning back into motion. But on the roof of the old staging facility, the general stood still. The file from the night before rested beneath a stone paperweight on the desk inside. The laptop was shut. The power disconnected. The pin lay in the same place he had left it, centered like a compass that no longer needed to point north. He had written the final report not for recognition. Not to clear a record, but because there were people out there still serving under his decisions even if they didn't know his name. He wasn't planning to disappear. He had already done that once. But he was stepping back, not from purpose, only from sight. The world didn't need him at the microphone. It needed the space his story created. He looked out across the horizon, the distant blur of the city center with its polished towers and planned ceremonies. Somewhere out there, another uniform was being doubted. Another voice was being ignored. Another story being rewritten by those with louder microphones and shorter memories. But not here. Not now. Below the building, a small group of volunteers had begun gathering for cleanup. They had no idea who occupied the space above them. One of them, a young woman with tired eyes and a firm grip on a trash bag, paused near the gate. Her gaze was pulled upward not by sound but by presence. She saw the figure outlined against the soft light of the sky. Not moving. Just standing. A silhouette in full uniform. Something in her posture straightened. She raised her hand to her brow. Not in mockery. Not in habit. But in honor. The general didn't see it. Or maybe he did and didn't react. He simply turned and descended the rooftop stairs. Each footstep steady, deliberate, echoing against the old walls like the final strokes of a long-written name being etched into history, not the kind of history found in textbooks, but the kind that lives in the minds of those who witness truth without needing it confirmed. He passed through the hallway, his cap in his hand now. He ran one thumb along the rim, not fidgeting but remembering. He didn't need the uniform anymore. It had done its job. Not by impressing. By enduring. At the rear of the building, a rusted side door creaked open. Outside, the light had softened. Morning had arrived in full. He stepped out onto the gravel path, now wet with dew. His boots left faint impressions as he walked. In his hand, he held the pin from the night before. He passed the boundary line of the radio tower fence. Then he paused and placed the pin gently into the dirt beneath a patch of grass, pressing it flat against the earth like a seed. No one would see it. But that was the point. Not all legacies need plaques. Some live in the way stories travel quietly from one soul to another, like a code passed in the dark, like a signal buried deep in the noise. He stood up, dusted his palms against his thighs, and looked westward toward nothing in particular. Just the open. And then he walked. Not toward a spotlight. Not toward a ceremony. But into the quiet. Where generals go when they've given all they had. Where the truth lives when history forgets. Where silence salutes what pride never saw.